So we're in Joel chapter 3 in our English Bibles, and if you'll remember, I talked the last couple of weeks about how there's actually 4 chapters in Joel in the Hebrew text, and so this is Joel 3 in our English Bibles and Joel chapter 4 in the Hebrew. So this is one singular ending section of Joel, so we're going to look at the 21 verses of this chapter. This chapter is also an extraordinarily important text when it comes to understanding end times and prophecy. It's actually kind of shocking to me that this chapter isn't discussed more in prophetic circles of all stripes. I guess one of the reasons that Joel 3 is overlooked is because it comes at the end of a book that is on a locust plague, and so that probably, dims its importance. But before we look at what Joel 3 says, let's remember why the book of Joel was written. Joel was not written simply to tell us the end times and what it's like when Christ will come back, when the Lord will rule on this earth physically. But Joel was written because the nation of Israel, or the southern nation of Judah, depending upon the time period when this book was written, they were experiencing a famine that was caused by locusts. And so this book was written, the context of Joel 3 is to provide comfort and hope to God's people in dark and difficult days. So the main thrust of Joel is that when difficult times come, when you have these times of loss and sorrow and sadness and poverty, we need to look to God and specifically find comfort in the fact that one day God is coming to earth. So the hope of the people of God in difficult times is not a rebound in the stock market. It's not the end of whatever current war we are going through. It's not getting through this pandemic. It's not voting a better politician into office. But our hope should always be fixed on one thing, and that is God himself. His Son, Jesus Christ, is coming to rule and reign on this earth. This tells us that our hope should be fixed on God and not our present circumstance. God's theory is not being worried that his people will become so heavenly minded that they'll be of no earthly good, but that once you become heavenly minded, you are of the most earthly good. So we want to be focused upon Christ, and I believe once we do that and the fact that he's coming back to this earth, we will be able to endure anything that this world throws at us. So Joel 3 is all about anticipating that day when God will come to earth. So let's begin to dive into that interpretation, into that anticipation, looking at verses 1 and 2 of Joel 3. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. Let's first note that what is clear from Joel is that even in the church age, God is not done with national Israel. That God's plan at the end is to restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. And from the perspective of Joel and his audience, this could have only one meaning. And that is God will restore, or he will prosper and bless the nation of Israel with Jerusalem as her capital. So these are national promises related to the people of Judah, and here we have God's first promise to his chosen nation. And that is, there will come a day when God will gather together all the nations and all the peoples who have persecuted his chosen people, and he will bring judgment upon them. We read that he will bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There's actually no such valley known as the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Instead, I think we get the importance of this location from the meaning of the name Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat means the Lord, or Yahweh judges. So again, I don't think this is saying we're going to look for a valley called Jehoshaphat, but God is talking about the valley, or the location where he will judge the nations. Now, if we put Joel together with our knowledge from the book of Revelation, we believe that this is a description of what is more popularly known as the Battle of Armageddon, when Jesus Christ will destroy the forces of the beast and the false prophet, when the nations have gathered together in order to finally wipe the Jewish people off the face of the earth. And as just a little side note, this is most popularly known as the Valley of Kidron. The first image I had in the PowerPoint was a picture of Kidron. This is another picture of it today. And so this is believed to be the most likely location for the Valley of Judgment. So Joel begins by saying, I'm going to restore the nation of Judah, and how you will know that I will restore that is the beginning of the restoration will be God bringing all the nations of the world together so that God might bring judgment upon them at his arrival. So then the question should be in the context of Joel, for what reason is God judging the nation? Because while we have lots of passages in the prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so forth as why God would judge the nations, Joel has not been about the evil of other nations. It's been about locusts and bugs. And so we have a brief passage in Joel 3 now about why God will judge the nations, their sins. And that is listed in verses 3 through 8 now of Joel 3. They have also cast lots for my people, traded a boy for a harlot, and sold a girl for wine that they may drink. Moreover, what are you to me, O Tyre, Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Are you rendering me a recompense? But if you do recompense me, swiftly and speedily I will return your recompense on your head. Since you have taken my silver and my gold, brought my precious treasures to your temple, and sold the sons of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks in order to remove them far from their territory. Behold, I am going to arouse them from the place where they have sold them, and return your recompense on your head. And I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hands of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabaeans, to a distant nation, for the Lord has spoken. So this is the one passage in Joel that has led a lot of scholars to date the book of Joel after either the exile that happened at the hand of the Assyrians or the exile that happened after the sins of after the conquest of Babylon. Because the sin that's highlighted in this passage is the sin of slavery and exile. So God's people were exiled from the land. They were sold into the slavery. The second sin that's mentioned in this section is the sin of ransacking and stealing the goods of the temple in order to take them into the temple of their foreign gods. Now, I don't think this necessitates a late date for the book of Joel. The reason I say that is that one thing that Deuteronomy tells us is Deuteronomy says, if my people disobey me, if they follow after other gods, if they disregard my law, the way that God will punish his people is by sending them in exile, sending them back into slavery, that will be God's punishment. So I don't think this is necessarily saying that these things have happened to Judah and Israel already, but it could be bringing up the fact that God will end up one day bringing these acts upon Jerusalem and upon Judah, and he will judge those nations whose hand it was that brought those upon his people. So I think based on these verses, I think they could work for both a late and an early date for Joel. But either way, based upon the dating, the key to understand here is that the Lord is denouncing the nations who were involved in the conquering and the enslavement of the Israeli or the Jewish people. But one of the interesting things, though, is that if you look at the people who are brought up as doing the enslaving and being involved in that practice, the specific people who are judged are Tyre, Sidon, and the coastal regions of Philistia. The intriguing thing is that the Philistines, the people of Tyre, the people of Sidon, they weren't the ones who enslaved the Israelite or the Jewish people. But they did have a role in the enslavement of the Israelites and the Jews at the exile. And that is the traders from Philistia, the traders from Tyre and Sidon, while they did not actually enslave the people of Israel, they were the middlemen. They were the ones who were involved in the slave trade to get the Israelite slaves from the location where they were taken as slaves to whoever it was that would buy them. So they were the ones running the merchant ships upon which the Israelite slaves would be transported. And I think the reason that they're brought up is to highlight that no matter where the nations fell in the profiting of the Israelite people, whether they were the ones who actually were imprisoning them, whether they were the tradesmen who were transporting them, or they were the buyers on the other end, no matter what role you had in that, all will be judged for their role in that slave trade of God's people. And I see these verses denouncing the theft of the articles of the temple and the slave trade of Israel as this is God's way of saying that at the end of time, before Jesus arrives on this earth, what God is going to do is he is going to judge all the nations for all the sins that they have ever committed against Israel in a single time and in a single moment of judgment. So that judgment that takes place when Jesus comes down on his white horse and judges the nation will not just be about what the nations of that generation and that era did, but this will be about the judgment of what all generations did against the people of Israel. So in that singular generation that God will be judging them for what Pharaoh in Egypt did to the Israelites, what General Titus did when he tore down Herod's temple, to what Hitler did in the Holocaust. All of those sins will fall upon that single generation when they will be judged at the end. And the point of this will be to show that no injustice will be forgotten. No injustice will be overlooked. But the Lord will pass judgment on those who have harmed his people for the glory of his name. And then the point of this to bring us comfort today is to let us know that we can have confidence that one day evil will be judged. One day justice will come upon all of those who brought sinful behavior upon those who are weak and needy. Sinners will face just consequences for their sins. And in verse 8, when it talks about the Israelites selling people back into slavery, I don't think this is telling us that the millennial kingdom is going to begin with a slave auction, that God's going to come to this world, he's going to set up his kingdom, and the first thing that they're going to do is the Israelites are going to have an auction to sell all the people who sold them. I think what this is a picture that the judgment that God will bring will be a judgment that is just and that will be fair. So I think it's a picture of the fact that God will bring the right judgment upon those who enslaved his people, and not a picture that we're going to be putting people into slavery at the beginning of the millennial kingdom. So the judgment that God will bring righteous, and it will be in accordance with their sin. And then now we're going to read about the actual destruction in the battle in verses 9 through 14. So verses 3 through 8 is why God will judge the world, and now we have the judgment in verses 9 through 14. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare a war. Rouse the mighty men. Let all the soldiers draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a mighty man. Hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there. Bring down, O Lord, your mighty ones. Let the nations be aroused and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. So let's make sure that we look at verses 9 through 11 in the right perspective to understand what Joel is saying. But verses 9 through 11, outside of that last little phrase where it says, bring down, O Lord, your mighty ones, everything that before that phrase comes up, what Joel is doing is Joel is calling all the nations to gather together in a single place in order to oppose the Lord in battle. So Joel is calling the nations, and he's saying, you want to oppose the Lord, this is your time to do it. Get everybody together, get the best army you possibly can, and come and try to take on my God. And the point of saying, beat your, what's he specifically say? Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears, is Joel is saying, take everything you possibly can and turn it into a weapon. Get every weapon that you can have. Get every soldier that you can have. Go to people who would normally be weak and be like, I don't want to fight. It's too scary for me. Tell that guy he's strong, because you're going to need every last soldier. So this is Joel saying, get every person you can, from the weakest farmer to the mightiest soldier. Bring them all together to battle the Lord, because you will need every single one. So Joel is arousing the nations. He's calling them to fight the Lord. And then the Lord will come down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is then renamed to the valley of decision. And I think there's a reason that it's called the Valley of Decision, and it's described this way. And that is, Joel has this really interesting picture where he calls upon all the multitudes of the world to come and fight the Lord. And you would assume that if you got all of the best armies in the world to come together and to battle the Lord and his forces, that it would be a battle like none we have ever seen before. But actually, that's not described that way at all. It's described as all of the nations will come to battle the Lord, and the Lord's might will be so great in comparison to them that he's just going to be making a decision of judgment upon them. That the Lord's might will be so superior that it will not be like a battle between two armies, but that the Lord will be described as a farmer bringing in a harvest for a field. I mean, if you think about it, when the farmer goes out on harvest day, it doesn't matter how big the field of wheat or the field of corn may be. There is no thought in the farmer's mind, oh no, the ears of corn are going to arise against me and possibly overcome me in battle. The fields could be as big as they want to be, and the farmer's just going to come in with a sickle and he's going to harvest the whole thing. And that's supposed to be the picture here. It doesn't matter how great and how awesome and how mighty and how numerous the armies of man are. When the Lord arrives, he's just going to simply reap them in a harvest like a farmer gathering his crops. And so I think one thing we need to see based on Joel 4 is that this final great battle, the final battle of Armageddon, it probably would not make for a very good Hollywood movie. Because when the Lord comes, it won't really be a battle. It won't really be a battle because Christ and his heavenly hosts are so vastly superior in strength and glory that I was trying to think about what could be a good equivalent to that. And the best equivalent I can think of to what it would be like is when I go out to my backyard and I see there is a fire ant mound. If I see any size fire ant mound in my backyard, I immediately do one thing. I go into my shed, I grab a rake, I grab the fire ant poison, I go out to that little fire ant mound, I rake it up so the ants will start going crazy, and then I spread the poison on there and they all die. And the thing about the fire ants is that it doesn't matter how many of them, they'll pour out there like a volcano. I'm just going to pour the poison on them and they will all die. It is no fight. It is no battle. And this is supposed to be the picture of the Lord coming down to this earth. That he's going to be like a farmer bringing his crops in. There will be no fight. There will be no opposition. And it's simply because the Lord is so vastly superior to his host, compared to the host of man. So it's sort of an interesting picture here. Joel's saying, get every army in the earth to come together. But then when the Lord comes down, he's going to gather them like a farmer, bringing in his crops. As in, he's so much better that there will be no fight. They'll have nothing to do but declare their guilt before the Lord. And then in verses 15 through 17, we see the perspective of the Lord coming now. We see the Lord coming now from the perspective of his own people. So in verses 9 through 14, it was what the Lord's coming will look like to the world, and now it is what the Lord's coming will look like to his own chosen people. So it says in verse 15, the sun and moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness. The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth tremble. But the Lord is a refuge for his people and a stronghold to the sons of Israel. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. So Jerusalem will be holy, and strangers will pass through it no more. So to the nations, the Lord will appear as the great judge with an overwhelming might that will reap them like a farmer bringing in his harvest. But to God's people, the Lord will be a refuge in the darkness. The sun and the moon and the stars may grow dark, but the Lord will be our light. He will stand before his people with the might of a lion. The image of the lion's roar and the earthquake is crucial for us. Because we need to remember the image of Joel chapter 3 it's a pretty disturbing image brought up at the beginning, because Joel is saying all of the nations of the world are going to surround you, Israel. All the nations of the world are going to surround you, O Judah. You're about to be wiped off the face of the earth and be forgotten. And if we're going to look at this from the perspective of an ancient Near Eastern perspective of Joel's time, the people of Israel will be thinking, because of this army that is surrounding us, we're going to be pillaged, our crops are going to be burned, our wives and our daughters are going to be raped, we're going to be sold into slavery, we're going to be pillaged and destroyed. If you're in that kind of situation, you don't want a lamb walking up to deliver you. You don't want a gentle shepherd coming and standing before you. You want the lion. You want the earthquake to stand before the armies of man. And so this was written to show us how the Lord is the ideal refuge for his people. So the book of Joel was written to comfort a struggling and impoverished people in the ancient world. And this book was meant to show us that when you are broken down, when you are being taken advantage of, when you are being conquered by other nations, God will come to his people as the lion. I don't know about you, but if I was ever in a situation where I was falsely accused of a crime I did not commit, I would not want a defender who was, kind of meek and soft-spoken and didn't really, was like, well, maybe that's your opinion about the evidence, but, I think maybe this could be the right view. I don't want a public defender to speak about me that way if I have been wrongly accused of the crime. I want the mad dog defender. I want the person who will boldly and clearly, state the facts of the crime. I want the person who will track down every lead. I want the person who's going to look for the one who actually did it. I want that kind of defender speaking on my case. And so the Lord is saying that when we are threatened, he will come and be the lion before us. He will be the strength of the earthquake. And the result of having the lion on your side is that then your city doesn't become a place where we're in a dire situation because the nations of the world have surrounded us. All of a sudden, our city has become a refuge. Zion has become a stronghold because the Lord of hosts is with us, because God has set that city apart for its very dwelling place. And if you're not a friend of the king, if you can't stand in unity with the lion, you won't even be able to pass through the city. And I believe that the line about the stranger not passing through is meant to symbolize the surety of the defense of the city. It's not that we just simply won't have enemy armies marching in, but even a stranger who's not welcome will not be able to slip past the guards and watch of the city. So the result of the Lord coming, first and foremost, is that his people will be made secure on the earth. What we are looking forward to in anticipation as the people of God is the day when the Lord will arrive on this earth in strength and in power, and in doing so will provide us with security like nothing this world has ever seen before. So whether it is invading armies or swarms of locusts or hurricane-force winds, after the Lord arrives, none of that will matter again, because God's strength equals God's security for his people. This is why the fear of the Lord is to bring peace. Because once we see that our God is the one to be feared, once we see the fact that if all the nations in the world, with all of their might and technology and weapons of warfare today, were to align against the Lord, we know that he has the strength to overcome all of those odds. I mean, we would probably call the unity of every military force on earth to be an overwhelming force, when in reality, all of them aligned against God himself alone, and God is still the overwhelming force, and they are the ones who cannot stand against them. So this is to allow us to rest in the strength of God in difficult and trying times. And then the chapter ends with yet another description of the transformation of the land of Israel when God comes for his people. We have so many of these in the prophets, it's kind of ridiculous. Verse 18 to 21. And in that day, the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk, and all the brooks of Judah will flow with water, and a spring will go out from the house of the Lord to water the valley of Shittim. Egypt will become a waste, and Edom will become a desolate wilderness, because of the violence done to the sons of Judah, in whose land they have shed innocent blood. But Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem for all generations. And I will avenge their blood, which I have not avenged, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So a reoccurring theme in the major and minor prophets is that one thing the Lord will do once he arrives upon the earth is that the Lord will transform the earth. The hope of the prophets is earthly. The hope of the prophets is terrestrial. It is not heavenly. They don't dream about God's people going up to heaven and walking on the streets of gold and glory and heaven with the Lord. What they dream of is God coming down to earth and turning the dirty roads of Jerusalem into gold, turning the desert fields around Jerusalem into fields that are filled with crops and flowing streams. One of the things, if you go around the desert areas around southern Judah area today, is that a lot of those areas are filled with these wadi streams, which is their empty, dry stream beds, 90% of the days of the year, but when they get those right rainfalls that one time a year, they become flowing streams through them. And what they're picturing is the day that those wadis that are streams one part of the year and are dry all the rest of the year, when the Lord arrives, they're going to be streams 365 days out of the year. They're going to bring great produce to the land. The Dead Sea will come to life, and the hills around Jerusalem will turn into the image of the green hills of Virginia. That is their hope. Now, one thing I think we also need to note is the question here is, will all the world be restored at Christ's return, or won't it? The interesting line here is that the lands of Egypt and Edom will be singled out as desolate wastes. And I've had a hard time trying to discern what were to gather from Edom and Egypt being discerned as desolate wastes, because especially from the perspective of what will be the nation of Israel if it follows under the borders of the land that God promised to Abraham, Edom will be part of Israel at that point. And so it's like, will God have a desert area in the kingdom of Israel to symbolize what Edom has done? Will Egypt stay desolate? Because it seems like the entire world is going to be transformed, and not just the singular nation of Israel based upon other passages. And so I think there's two ways we could take this. One, that the Lord will leave all of the land that was Edom at that time period, and maybe a large portion of the nation of Egypt as wastelands to symbolize this is what happened to the people who were overly zealous in enslaving and persecuting my people. So maybe it will be a symbol for what happened to God's people and how he judged them during the millennial kingdom. But also, there's another way that you could take it, and that is thinking about how this could be viewed from a Hebrew mindset. One of the things that they do in Hebrew that we sometimes do in English, but not as often, is they use extremes in order to show priority. So one thing that we read is that God says, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. And that actually doesn't mean that God hated Esau, but it means God loved Jacob more than he loved Esau. When Jacob was speaking of his two wives, Leah and Rachel, he says, I loved Rachel and I hated Leah. It doesn't mean that he actually hated Leah. It just means that he loved Rachel more than his other wife. And those two extremes are meant to show that this person that I still love, I do love that person. Jacob would say, I love Leah, but I love Rachel so much that in comparison to my love for Rachel, other people might say that I hate Leah, even though I really love Leah. It just shows how extreme his love is for his other wife. So this could be a Hebrew way of saying, not that he's going to leave Edom and Egypt desolate, but that the nation of Israel will be in such a land of bounty and produce, and it will grow so much better than the nations around it, that those ones will seem desolate, even though they have been restored and made better as well. I think that really fits with how their thinking goes in Hebrew. I think it falls in line well with that, but we also need to say they could be set apart as areas of desolation for that time period. But either way would work for the Hebrew mindset. And the chapter ends with a commitment of vengeance for the Lord upon those who have attacked his people. And while we may personally want to avert our eyes from vengeance and only see God as a God of grace, I do think it is important to remember that vengeance will come upon those who brought suffering on others. I think if you have suffered greatly, you know the importance of justice and vengeance falling upon those who brought your suffering. So I believe one way that we can rest today in the midst of our suffering is to know that God will bring a future vengeance upon those who have wronged us today. And I actually believe that that will allow us to forgive those that have wronged us. Because we can know that even if we forgive someone who wronged us today, that God will ultimately bring justice and judgment into creation and into their lives. So we don't need to be the one to make things right, but we can rest in the justice of God at the end of days. So let's put all of this together. So what do we know about the coming of the Lord based upon the book of Joel? The first thing we know about the coming of God to this earth, the coming of Jesus Christ, is that our hope should rest upon the coming of Christ to this world. The purpose of eschatology is not just to have a knowledge of end-time events, but it is to give us hope to endure times of suffering. Second thing that we learn is that the hope of God's people is intended to be God coming to earth and not our going to God in heaven. I believe that even when people get to heaven, they are going to anticipate the return of Christ to this earth even more so than we do when we're alive today. I think that when we go to heaven, we'll be even more excited about the day when Jesus Christ comes to this earth. That should be our hope. The third thing that we note from this passage is that the Lord will be opposed by a vast army of the majority of the human race at his arrival. And his victory over that army will be so overwhelming that even the greatest armies and battles of history will be seen as nothing in comparison, that the Lord going against these forces will be as dramatic as farmers bringing their crops in at the end of the day. The Lord will just overwhelm the forces before him. The fourth thing that we learn is that once the Lord arrives, he will remain. He will remain as a secure defense for his people. And then finally, the final thing that we learn is that when the Lord returns to this world, he will transform the earth into a glory that hasn't been seen, in my opinion, since before the flood, and maybe not even since the days of Eden. I believe the transformation of the world at Christ's second coming, when he comes back at the end of the tribulation period, I think it will transform the world similar to what we saw during the pre-flood era. And so I think it'll look some ways like that. So this is the hope of God's people. So our hope in difficult times should be that there will be a day when the Lord will come to this earth. He will judge the wicked, and he will protect his own and restore this earth. And so when we have times of difficulty and trial, whether it's problems with our physical body, opposition due to people who are sinning against us, or maybe our own personal struggles with sin, we are to look forward to that day when the Lord will come to this earth, and we will all know, based on what Joel says, that those who call upon the name of the Lord will not be disappointed. We will all be saved.